And greetings. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the Steve Deace Show here live and on demand on Blaze TV, radio, and podcast with Aaron McIntyre. My hero. He has vanquished the latest plague to hit this studio. And there will be more, rest assured. And then there's Todd Erzin as well. I don't know what he does. He just sits over there and complains. Meanwhile, Aaron's out here literally saving lives. So there's that. We are brought to you by our friends over at Equipping the Persecuted. Every day, 17 Christians are murdered for their faith by Islamic terrorists in Nigeria alone. Your $35 monthly donation can help to save lives. Visit equippingthepersecuted.org to join the cause. Act now, donate today at equippingthepersecuted.org. And that, what I just said, by the way, is one of the reasons why we are going to call a one-week audible for our first Theology Thursday of the year coming up in the next hour of the show. Because as we have seen the breaking story out of the UK of refugee gangs, we saw more Islamic terrorism in our own country over the holidays. Next hour, I'm going to lay out for you everything you've ever really needed to know about Islam, but we're afraid to ask. I've got 9 points I want to go through next hour. And I'm gonna keep it as accessible and understandable as possible, because this is something that as many people as possible need to access and understand, because it is one of the main tipping points, inflection points in the culture and what's left of Western civilization today. And so that's going to be Theology Thursday next hour, and then next week we'll pick up where we left off at the end of the year with our study of the book of Romans. All right. Also, you're going to be introduced to one of the COVID heroes that I profiled along with Daniel Horowitz in our best-selling book, Rise of the Fourth Reich. He's got his own book out now about his experience. And speaking of persecution, what he faced for daring to help and save and treat people during the scamdemic. So he's going to join us a little bit later on in this hour. But before we get there, let's get to Aaron's rundown of what happened while we were away.
What happened while we were away, brought to you by leftist chickens coming home to roost. Horrible wildfires continued to rage in Los Angeles County yesterday. At least 5 people have died as several wind-driven fires blazing across Los Angeles County remain mostly uncontained. The newest to break out is the Sunset Fire in the Hollywood Hills, where evacuation orders have been issued. The Palisades fire that is scorching the seaside area between Malibu and Santa Monica has exploded to more than 17,000 acres with zero containment. It's destroyed at least 1,000 structures, making it the most destructive ever in Los Angeles County. Tens of thousands are now displaced, with many more thousands of businesses and structures threatened. That horror and destruction is, of course, lost on Democrats, who had themselves a day yesterday, starting with California Governor Gavin Newsom, literally surrounded by flaming destruction, who had this to say.
Firefighter in this block, they left because there was no water in the hydrant here.
The local folks are trying to figure that out. I mean,
Joe Biden wants you to know what he's prioritizing, speaking in Santa Monica.
The good news is I'm a great-grandfather.
Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass was caught by Sky News on her way back from Ghana.
Do you owe citizens an apology for being absent while their homes were burning? Do you regret cutting the fire department budget by millions of dollars, Madam Mayor? Have you nothing to say today? Have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today? Elon Musk says that you're utterly incompetent. Are you considering your position? Madam Mayor, have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today who are dealing with this disaster?
She wasn't done yet.
Right now, if you need help, emergency information, resources, and shelter is available. All of this can be found at URL.
A URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator, also known as a web address. She was supposed to read a website for support and resources for L.A. residents, but instead just said URL. Listen to this local TV station in L.A. where an anchor tried to fact-check a local businessman before the anchor himself was fact-checked by his own reporter.
Former L.A. mayoral candidate and real estate developer Rick Caruso criticizing the city's response to the windstorm and fires.
You got to have water, and my understanding is the reservoir was not refilled in time and in a timely manner to keep the hydrants going.
Despite what you have heard from Caruso, no firefighters have told us that they are running out of water.
And let's go out to Gigi Graciette. She is live in Pacific Palisades. I know your signal's not the best, but Gigi, what can you tell us?
Well, firefighters have told me they have no water on this block.
Of course, the typical leftist barrage of opining about climate change hit social media and elsewhere. I'm sure global warming explains why LAFD was forced at one point, seen here, to use a women's purse to carry water to extinguish one fire. Donald Trump yesterday called for the resignation of California Governor Newsom. Here he is nearly 7 years ago in the aftermath of another major California forest fire, calling for change in the way California pursues forest management.
It's cleaned out and protected. We've got to take care of the floors, the floors of the forests, very important. You look at other countries where they do it differently, and it's a whole different story. I was with the president of Finland, and he said, we have a much different, we're a forest nation. He called it a forest nation. And they spend a lot of time on raking and cleaning and doing things, and they don't have any problem. And when it is, it's a very small problem.
Speaking of Donald Trump, here he is this morning at the funeral for former President Jimmy Carter, talking to and making Barack Obama laugh. Here's when Kamala Harris sat down in front of Trump. What is going through her mind? Wrong answers only. Joe Rogan welcomed historian and Christian apologist Wesley Huff on his Joe Rogan Experience podcast this week. That's the largest podcast in the world, with roughly 14 million listeners each episode. The two spent hours discussing the person and work of Jesus Christ, but towards the end, the conversation went deeper when Huff mentioned Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson and whether Jesus Christ is merely an archetype of morality.
I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over.
And is the crossover, you think, connected to a life in academia? Or
no.
What do you think it is?
I wonder, and I'd love to talk to him about this, like how do you remedy this issue that, because he seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example is more important than the actual flesh and blood first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. That's an example for us to look on and live by. But I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior. And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that because Jesus was very against moralism.
And finally, this.
Say that again?
Why is there a fire happening right now?
There are multiple fires that are taking place.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're in the news though. You're supposed to know.
Well, I don't know how it started. We don't know how it started. There,
I think
winds.
It's all the gay people in LA.
Okay, there we go.
And that's what happened while we were away.
Aaron's mod. Aaron's montage brought to you by our friends over at Birch Gold. Increased tariffs on our trade partners, tax cuts, regulation changes. Learn why gold is a viable diversification tactic now more than ever. Birch Gold is releasing their new ultimate guide for gold in the Trump era with a foreword by Donald Trump Jr. himself. So to get your free copy, along with Birch Gold's free information kit on gold, text my name, Steve, to the number 989-898. Text Steve to the number 989-898. Here's the facts. The national debt continues to increase. Our interest payments on such debt continue to increase. Gold is still your hedge against a weakened dollar and government debasement schemes. Still the company that you can trust to convert your existing IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold. So text Steve to 989-898. Get your free copy of the ultimate guide for gold in the Trump era. No obligation, no information. Just text my name, Steve, to the number 989-898. Text Steve to 989-898.
That's why you're a pro. Totally unfazed by juvenile hijinks. Right into that Birch Gold read. Flawless. I dare you to do better.
Well, when you have the sense of humor of a sixth grader, as I will perpetually have, my sense of humor has never left the sixth grade. I'm well versed now at going on 50. I'm 51 years old. I've made that segue many, many times. So thank you. I appreciate it. let's actually start. No. I was going to say, let's actually start from the rear and work our way back. But then I realized after that clip that Aaron played and closed the montage with, maybe that wasn't the way to go. But
sixth grade or not,
it is. It's also a metaphor, frankly, for much of what's going on in our society. Buggery is all is buggery. That's essentially what's happening. But I haven't spoken a lot, and it's on purpose, about the Jordan Peterson and religion discussion, because he's done shows. He was doing, I think, a walk through Exodus, I want to say, with Dennis Prager a couple years ago. He's had a lot of conversation about this, and it's kind of clear to me this is a guy trying to work out his own salvation in fear and trembling. What does all of this mean, right? I think his wife actually has had a rededication of her faith. I think I read it a couple of years ago, right? So I don't want to muzzle the ox while it's treading its grain. And the guy does a lot of important cultural work. And ultimately that's between him and the Holy Spirit. But there is something I have noticed in these conversations that he has had more openly about faith. Is he gets extremely angry if you challenge him theologically. Jordan Peterson does. Like loses it, like blocks people. Saw him do that I think he did it to Larry Taunton last year. And a couple of other people I think I saw. Gets really angry about it. And this is a guy who's pretty unflappable in a lot of hostile debate settings most people have never gone into and faced straight away as he has. And I think Wesley, and I got to say, it's just, when they say in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that Aslan is on the move, what does it mean? It means Wesley Huff. I didn't know what a Wesley Huff was a few weeks ago. No clue. Never heard the name in my life. And I've been fairly well connected in the cultural engagement, sphere within the church for going on a second decade now. Never heard the name in my life. Okay, you know how I heard of Wesley Huff? When I started seeing the promotion for him doing an appearance on Rogan show, I did not know who he was. And then the dude just goes on there. He's I'm just profiling him, looking at him. Looks pretty jacked up. Probably more of a kind of a workout warrior, CrossFitter kind of guy. So I can see why Rogan would be attracted to talking to him, because he's in that, in that lifestyle too. So I could see why Rogan was like, all right, if we're going to finally go down the road and have this conversation, give me an actual man here and not an amoeba that I think I can probably just, intimidate and squish. I saw your buddy William Wolf post yesterday after watching that interview, Aaron, with Wes Huff and Joe Rogan. Now imagine you're a young man, dude, and you listen to this guy on 3 hours just stand for the gospel, and you're like, okay, maybe I got to check this out. And you walk into your average American Big Eva suburban church, because that's where all the cool kids go, and you cannot believe how woke and soft and white privileged everybody is. And you're like, what is the disconnect from what I just listened to in this conversation and what I am seeing at this church? Right, that was a phenomenal observation that Mr. Wolf had. Okay. This is just how God works. I mean, someone that a lot of people never heard of gets on the biggest show of all time at the very beginning of the year and goes mano-y-mano, toe-to-toe for 3 hours. And, I mean, that guy's ministry, which is I'm all for, is the amount of... out of curiosity, I checked his X following the day before he got on Rogan. It was around 30,000. I checked it this morning. It's over 50,000 now. I mean, that's like 80% growth. All right? You can just tell. I mean, when the Lord has his hand on something, it looks like what just happened with Wes Huff. Guy just comes out of absolutely nowhere, gets on Rogan, crushes it, and he does not look and talk and have the mannerisms of most of what America has been sold as evangelicalism in the last generation. He just does not. And that's why much of America has rejected evangelicalism in the last generation. So the conversation about Peterson, and since they're going to use the word archetype, and I admire what Jordan Peterson has done culturally. And primarily, our show is a cultural engagement show. It's a biblical worldview show. We're not a ministry. I mean, we believe in the priesthood of every believer, but it's not overtly a ministry. I'm not a nonprofit. It's a for-profit. I'm not a formal member of any ministry. We're all laymen here. Okay, we're broadcasters, right? We're just Christians who are broadcasters here. We're not doing necessarily a Christian broadcast overtly. It's impossible for us to talk about the issues of the day and not have you guys receive our analysis and thoughts through the filter of our primary belief systems. And we believe in those primary belief systems, and we want to increase their reach and influence. But there's a reason why we have Theology Thursday, and we do a verse by verse Bible study like once a year, if that. And Theology Thursdays once a week, because it's primarily a show about cultural issues and engagement. And in many respects, what Wes Huff types are doing is upstream from where we are. That essentially, after they have done their work, and then people hear their stuff and are convinced, they're like, well, what do I do now? And our show comes along and says, well, we got the now, we can help you with that. Frankly, we got fires all over the place, not just the literal ones in California. And so we need a firefighter over there, we need a firefighter over there, and a firefighter over there. You know what I'm saying? You're trained, you're equipped by the Wes Huffs in your church, so we'll put you to work now, right? The rest of the week, right? And because Peterson is such a viable and positive weapon on the cultural engagement side, and I've got other places with people who are not as good of a warrior for truth, where I can make these observations without picking a fight with him, I've just chosen to do that, frankly. All right. But since this came up on the biggest show in the world right now, and his name was specifically invoked, I actually want to use Jordan Peterson as his own archetype. And I really believe that his anger, or people's anger, and those people can be, I know we use the term Pharisee as a negative. But again, if you go back to the era itself, the Pharisees were the good guys. The Pharisees were the heroes. They kept the faith alive during the diaspora. The Sadducees were the ones who basically had given up on Jehovah. The Pharisees still taught the word of God. That's why when you read the Gospels, you see Christ arguing with the Pharisees way more than the Sadducees. But it's ultimately a Sadducee, Caiaphas, who sentences him to his death by having him arrested and taking him to Pilate. So the Pharisees, for the most part, are the good guys. They're the ones that have the respect of the people. They're the keepers of the flame. So why are they so angry at Christ? For the same reason I think Jordan Peterson and as an archetype gets angry if you challenge his theology. Because none of us desires to admit we are a sinner. None of us do. The basic human instinct, when faced with the specter of our own sin, is to react like Gavin Newsom does in that clip. That's not my problem. I did my job. I'm good, man. Somebody else's problem. Somebody else did that. I'm a victim. You guys will have to figure it out. Some variations of these themes. It is impossible for Christ to be a moral archetype. It's impossible. He doesn't give you that option. I mean, would you consider someone who lied about their identity to be any form of a moral archetype? Is that typically the launching point for someone being a moral archetype? No. Lying about who they are? And he claims to be God numerous times. Numerous. If you're in a religion that claims to be Christian and says Jesus isn't God, they have edited out numerous verses, not just of the entirety of the New Testament, but Christ's own words. Basically, they've taken the Gospel of John, where he refers to himself as I am multiple times, which is an invoke. That's why they wanted to kill him. They knew what he was saying when he said I am. He's invoking what God says to Moses, what Jesus says to Moses at the burning bush. They've edited so much of the Bible out. You should start asking yourself how much of it, since they got that wrong, how much of the rest of it did they get right? You're not left with the option that he's a moral archetype. You're not. And one of the greatest descriptions of this is the liar, lord, lunatic of C.S. Lewis. Those are your only options. Those are the only options you're left. He's a liar, he was insane, or he's Lord, and there is no other. Those are your only three options. You're not left with anything in between. When I got in trouble with some members of MAGA last year for saying there are founding fathers who are in hell, and there are. You know why? For the same thing that for Jordan Peterson as an archetype, get upset about. Ben Franklin said there was no greater moral teaching on the earth he'd ever encountered other than Jesus Christ. There's zero evidence whatsoever that he ever repented of his sins before Christ as Lord. Doesn't mean he didn't, we just don't know. Because that's what forces me to look at me. I got a post on X the other day when the rape grooming gangs first began to break, and I posted in response to one of the first stories that were out there, don't ever again question why a loving God permits a hell. And someone wrote back to me, well, I don't question that, but I do question why he allows stuff like this to happen. Well, God made us blameless. He looked at us and said we were good. He gave us dominion over the earth. We chose to rebel. Then after he rebelled, he gave us dads to protect the children. He gave us governments to protect the citizens. He gave us his law through Moses so that we would know what is right and wrong. I mean, the only thing you have left to ask of God at this point is just to have never made any of us ever at all. I guess if there's one thing you want to complain to God about, that would be it. Well, then why'd you do any of this at all? But you won't do that, though. You know why you won't do that? Because it'll implicate yourself. No one voluntarily wants to look at the man in the mirror. It's the great one of the great moments ever of the great Catholic apologist G.K. Chesterton, when he was asked by the Daily Mirror. They had a series of thinkers at the time, or maybe it was the London Times, I can't remember. And they had a series of thinkers provide Sunday essays about what's wrong with the world. Chesterton sent in the shortest column. Me. That was his answer. That was his column. Me. We don't want to accept that. We don't. And I think actually the better you are as a quality of person and truth seeker, the braver you are, the more courage you have, the more self-assurance you have. I mean, if you're Jordan Peterson and you're like, man, I've gone into the lion's den, and now you're telling me that's not good enough? That's not good enough, but some, serial killer has a jailhouse confession on death row, and supposedly that is? I can understand why that's the case. And the better we tend to be in a fight, the less likely we want to admit there is something wrong with us, that the problem is me. And this is why some of the greatest figures in the history of the church prior to coming to Christ were visibly broken people. Visibly broken. Because they had come to the end of themselves and realized, yes, the problem ultimately here is me.
You're describing why pride is the deadliest of the seven deadly sins.
Correct. And this is why God had to put a guy like Wes Huff come out of complete nowhere and put him on Rogan's show. And many of your best-selling washboard abs, pleated khaki, sweater-vested evangelical superstars, he wouldn't. And ultimately, if we are going to fix this culture, ultimately, this is what we have to come to grips with. Because if we don't understand that we're in need of a Savior, we cannot govern ourselves. We can't do it. We can't do it. It's impossible. We will turn on one another. We will wield power against one another. Am I describing at all what seems like what's been happening in the culture for the last few decades?
Of course.
We can't do it. We can't govern ourselves. It's the William Penn observation. If men were angels, we wouldn't need government. We cannot govern ourselves until we admit a need for God. We cannot do it. The minute we believe we are the people we've been waiting for, we're the heroes of the story, that it's about us from either direction, we've lost. And the enemy has us right where he wants us. That is true humility. So much of what we think and describe as characteristics in our culture today is based on tone and temperament. Or that's another nice way of saying emotion-based. Like if you said something to me that I received as nice, then it's considered loving. If you said something to me that I didn't receive as nice, my own subjective definition thereof, then it was not. And much of what we think of humility means, I'm quiet, and I'm a wallflower, and I'm a walkover, and I'm unassuming. That's not what it means. In fact, in many respects, that's another form of idolatry. And it's very selfish. You were made in God's image. You've got gifts, talents, something to offer the world. So offer it. That's why you're here. Humility is not a temperament. It's not a financial statement or a lack thereof. It's a recognition that God is God and I am not. That's really what it is. And I want to make sure that our side is careful. Because one of these sides needs to remember this. The other side has clearly given up on it entirely. And therefore has been given over. And we will be too, if we give up on that. We will be too. And the temptation for us is different. Well, they're the Sadducees over there. They gave up on the faith. They don't teach the Torah anymore. We're the good guys here. Because the standard is not how we subjectively compare ourselves to one another. Ultimately, the standard is how we compare to the only standard that really ultimately matters, and that's God's. And if we lose track of that, no matter how brave or courageous we may be, how useful in a fight we may be, we have lost the only fight that ultimately matters. With our own demons. More in a moment.
The Steve Deace Show.
Well, your temperature at night can go a long way into having an impact on your quality of sleep. If you wake up too hot, too cold, I highly recommend you check out the bed sheets that we use. Miracle Made's bed sheets. They're inspired by NASA. They use silver-infused fabrics that are temperature regulating, so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. And man, living in the Midwest, we get them all. You know, we get scorching hot summers, bitterly cold winters. Then you get the spring and the fall where you've maybe got the windows open during the day and the heat on at night, right? And over the last couple of years, man, our Miracle Made sheets have stood the test. They've been phenomenal. And as much as I love going out and speaking, in our spare time, because it gives me so much time to meet people like you, I always miss our sheets when we're away because they are that awesome. All right, so if you want to upgrade your sleep this year, go to trymiracle.com/Deace, trymiracle.com/Deace to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code Deace at checkout, you'll get a free 3-piece towel set and save an extra 20% as well. So upgrade your sleep. trymiracle.com/Deace. Use the code Deace to get a free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off at trymiracle.com/Deace. Again, trymiracle.com/Deace. Name of the book, The Most Dangerous Man in Washington, but it may not be the Washington that you necessarily think. And the author, Scott Miller, was one of the stories of heroism that we profiled in our best-selling book, Rise of the Fourth Reich, back in 2023. And he joins us now as well. Scott, Happy New Year to you, brother. It's a pleasure to have you with us, man. How are you?
Good. Happy New Year to you.
So, Scott, tell us a little bit about the Washington here is not Washington, D.C., just to clarify that for the audience.
Correct. No, it's Washington State.
So what happened to you in the tiny little hamlet of Washington State when you dared do this thing called practice medicine and try to help people during the worst pandemic of our lifetimes, allegedly?
What happened? Well, it's interesting being in Texas now where it was just it was like a different country compared to what Washington State was like. But it was I was sharing a story with my wife that I was reading for the second book, and she was looking through it, and we forget, like for me, like I had a pediatric practice, and we forget the devastation that these policies, these mandates had on our children. And I mean, like across the board on every metric of their growth, development, learning, emotional. I mean, it's so sad knowing that was imposed on them. And one of the things that I tried to do was try to upend all of those mandates and policies and get schools back open and have children living freely without masks or fear. So I kind of did a number of things that was antithetical to what the agenda was.
What do you think the agenda was, Scott? Not what they said, but based on what they did, what it was.
I think there's, it's multifaceted. The initial thing that I thought was this is a beta test to see how quickly and easily they can inculcate fear to the degree that we allowed terms like essential and non-essential workers to be used for us to keep, to shut down private businesses to see how quickly they could get mass compliance for things that typically what you would say most, patriotic Americans would never conceive of doing. So I think that was one of the things. It was just like this mass, like I said, beta test to see like what would it take for us to get most of America to do something antithetical to what Americans should be doing, and do it under the guise of patriotism. Like we're not doing it for us, we're doing it for our neighbors, for our fellow man, and that set us up. So not for me, but that set everybody up, I think, to be even more compliant when they rolled out an untested bioweapon and people lined up to get it injected into them, like willingly. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, about 80% of American adults took at least one dose of the toxic genetic serum. Yes.
Yeah, which is heartbreaking. I mean, and when I hear that, it breaks my heart.
It's the most injected substance in all of human history. When you look at what the rates were globally, it's the most injected substance in all of human history, actually.
Yeah, and I was asked to join a backs injury group, and there's 5,000 people on that, which is, it's small, but I've been on there for, the first time I was on there, it was 13 hours I spent answering questions and trying to help guide people to at least some type of treatment, modality to decrease the devastation that's happened to their body.
Well, let's go back to the beginning here and take you back to your former home state of Washington State, why they considered you to be so dangerous. Take a couple of minutes and just tell our audience your story.
So from the beginning, so March 12th, 2020 was when that was my birthday, because I remember it vividly, and it's when we started watching the country shut down. And I just remember Anthony Fauci coming on saying there's no treatment, there's nothing we can do. You need to, shelter in place and basically just be afraid and wait for some potential vaccine. And I was known as being fairly creative in coming up with solutions for very complex pediatric cases. And my wife was like, well, can't you figure out how to treat it? And I was like, well, I don't know. I'm glad she thought that highly of me. So I just started doing in-depth studies and deep dives. And unbeknownst to me, I was already treating it with adults that had been coming into the clinic over the previous month that had these persistent, unrelenting coughs, et cetera. And I would put them on budesonide, treat it like asthma, basically, and it would get better right away. And I was shocked at how quickly their improvement was. And then, of course, the in vitro studies with ivermectin out of Australia in April. And so it was a standalone pediatric practice. I was the only one there, so I could do pretty much whatever I wanted. So I'm like, I'm just going to start treating people. And a mom asked me to come.
Just so our audience understands, because I brought this up with asthma as an asthmatic, and I spent time in and out of hospitals as a little boy with vicious asthma attacks, okay? So this idea that there's nothing we can do to symptomatically treat pulmonary inflammation, nothing we can do at all. There's just nothing we can do at all to treat symptomatic, because this symptomatizes like pulmonary inflammation, right? I can't breathe, I cough, I can't catch my breath, all that stuff. That's what threw me for a loop. And you just did the simple connecting of dots there in your own practice in Washington State.
Well, it's like you said, if you went in with asthma and they hit you with albuterol and it sort of worked, but not really, and you were still in respiratory distress, what would they do? They would put you on, an IV of 125 milligrams of Solumedrol. They wouldn't be like, well,
we've got nothing,
stopped.
Right?
We've ran the gambit of, what we're able to do. It's like you do whatever it takes to figure it out. Like you just A, do no harm, and then B, like find whatever modalities you need to mitigate the symptoms. And that was what was like, because this wasn't just like April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December of 2020. This narrative has continued on, right? I mean, we're now in 2025. And if you go to Johns Hopkins University, like the gold standard of care, and you look at the modalities for treating things, it's exactly the same as 2021. And so is the narrative that everything else is unsafe or ineffective. And so we're still there. It's like our premier teaching hospitals are still shoveling absolute lies to the public. And I have people talking to me all the time, like, how do we know who to trust? I'm like, it's hard. That's really a sad question, because, I have a friend that went into the hospital a couple days ago, and a very, very close friend. And I talked to, I don't want to get into it, but it was like, I told her husband, it's like, if you don't take over her care, she will likely not make it. And he was like, I'm on it. And he helped facilitate care. And all of a sudden, she's like oxygen saturation at 100%. They still don't know what's going on, because we're trying to get them to run the correct labs, but they were basically just like, well, we don't know. And I'm like, that's where we are today.
How many people would you quantify for us, would you estimate you were able to help in the early days of the pandemic there in Washington State?
I mean, it was thousands. Thousands of, directly maybe 5,000, indirectly, because of how awesome people were and them taking the information that they got and then like that kind of groundswell throughout churches and community, like the things that
word got out and people start sending you referrals. Yes.
Yeah. So with using that, it was, I don't know, but it was, every day I have people reaching out saying, you don't know me, but, a friend came to our, a friend came to us after, you treated them or after hearing about you. So it's, I don't know, but I would say I'm blessed to know that, when God asked me to stand up and serve, and I'm like, okay, like I'm not having a clue what it meant.
So in the state of Washington gave you the Albert Schweitzer Award. That's not what they did, actually. They did not give you an award for all the people you helped. What did the state do to you instead?
They began a fairly intensive a legal campaign against my license, and then in October of 21, I had an emergency suspension of my license because they said I was using my credentials in a mass disinformation campaign that was causing basically wildfire spread of a disease during a worldwide pandemic.
How long did you have to fight that?
From August 10th of 2020 to about 3 months ago.
Wow. How was it ultimately?
They just kept coming.
Of course, you can. The one thing that we noticed from the beginning, that there were two things about COVID that did not pass my smell test from the beginning. One, the denial of natural immunity. So essentially how human beings survived plagues before vaccines were even introduced in the latter 18th century. Okay, so what did we do for 6,000 years before that? Before we washed our hands or anything else, how'd we survive? That's number one. But the other is that there could never be a control group. There could never be one. Like we could never see in real time what the difference between masking and unmasking was, locking down and not locking down was. There could never be a control group. Now, another way to look at that, if you're running a scamdemic or a criminal enterprise, is you always want to tie up the loose ends. Okay, that's in a criminal racket. It's not called the control group. It's called the loose end. You tie up all the loose ends so that my alibi and motive cannot be questioned. Okay, so that the guilt does not come back to me. And people like you and several of the other names that we interviewed in our book, Rise of the Fourth Reich, and that were frequently on our show, you guys were the loose ends. You guys could not be permitted to be control groups to point out what they did here. And that's why they had to follow you to the bitter end. And I've only got about 3 minutes left. I want to make sure moving forward that we give some encouragement to people. What did this experience teach you? What did you learn from it? And what would you say to encourage others to be brave in the future, Scott?
I'll say when you know truth, when you know what the truth is, when you know truth, and I'll say this just as a Christian, and knowing that none of this, nothing I did could have been even remotely accomplished without the direct intervention of God. And so it's, and you can't live in fear and faith in one accord. So I just chose, I'm like, okay, God, I'm going to put this, I'm just going to give myself to you, and whatever mission you want me to serve, I will follow, it is scary. I mean, there's an aspect where, but just be I was politely unapologetic about resisting or ignoring everything that I saw as mandates coming from man when they were going directly against what I considered God's commands. And I didn't care what anybody thought. And I was never mean. I was just like, live in that truth and share it, and it will multiply. And when you have that, people would look at me and they say, that's courage. I'm like, it's not courage. It's just, I can't, if I bend the knee to something I know is false, then I'm no longer serving. I can't do that. And it's like, I'm going to serve one master. And I would just tell people, when you see something that feels wrong, and pray about it and ask for the Holy Spirit to give you discernment and guidance. But if it feels wrong and it seems wrong, then trust that it's probably evil. And buy the book. It's a good book. Really, I've been told it's even for my wife, where she's read it and she'd be like, Scott, I had no idea. She read a chapter. She's like, I had no idea that was what was going on. I was like, what did you think I was doing? She's like, no one knew. We were just like, where did he go for 2 days? So it's a pretty interesting read.
Well, I know you've heard from a lot of the people you treated, and as you were undergoing this ordeal, that we're very thankful for what you did to help them and their family members. So well done, good and faithful servant, man. And I'm glad you got out of there and into the state of Texas as well. All right.
Well, we had to. Our attorneys called us and said, you have to
get out of there. Yes.
As quickly as possible. So,
yes. Well, they did you a favor, because you're in a better place now for sure. All right. If you want to get the book, it's titled The Most Dangerous Man in Washington by Scott Miller. The Most Dangerous Man in Washington by Scott Miller. It's available over on Amazon right now. The Most Dangerous Man in Washington by Scott Miller. It's good to talk to you again, brother. And I wish the best for you moving forward. And again, well done. Good and faithful servant. All right. Good luck with the book.
Thank you. Thanks for all that you do.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Take care.
You too. All right. That's The Most Dangerous Man in Washington. Book on sale now at Amazon. The story of Scott Miller. And it was one of the most powerful stories we told in Rise of the Fourth Reich, what happened to him. So what do you guys think?
The fact that he went through all that, and many like him did, and are continuing to go through that, and no lessons apparently learned. Way fewer people than you think have realized something went drastically wrong. It has everything to do with the first segment, Steve. People think they're basically good.
Yes.
And they were
which means they think they're God.
And this made them feel really important. Yes. And even if mistakes were made, we were all trying our hardest. Good people did their best. No. You were bad people who did bad things. And you can't do good things, and God expects you to do good things, but you can't understand what the good is unless you understand that he's good and you're bad.
Amen to that.
We ain't gonna forget. We're just, again, as optimistic as I am, we can never forget what happened.
No. Hour 2 is next. Some other things we in the West have forgotten that I'm going to remind us of when we return.
Deace.
All right, back here with Hour 2, live and on demand on Blaze TV, radio, and podcast with Todd Erzin. Aaron McIntyre, show hero, saving us from the latest plague.
That was a good-looking mouse, though. That's not like the mice, I should say, that I remember growing up. Those were all gray and mangy. This one was a good-looking one.
It was a big one. That was a big mouse that you got for us. So thank you, my hero. We are the Steve Deace Show. That is me. Let us know what you think about what we think via the stevedeace.com inbox. You can email us, steve@stevedeace.com. That's DEACE. Like us on Facebook, MeWe, and Gab. You can follow me at Steve Deace Show on X, Instagram, and TikTok. Also, make sure that you subscribe to our new YouTube channel as well at Deace Show there. We're starting all over there because we told too much truth. And helped people like Scott Miller we just had on the show about his new book, The Most Dangerous Man in Washington. All right. And because of that, we got censored so much that we had to start all over. In fact, I saw a guy today say on X who had one of the largest UFO accounts on YouTube. And when he started posting about the drones over New Jersey, YouTube went back and demonetized all of his videos from 2018. Guy made that claim today, which I would normally just poo-poo because the guy's been spending 8 years making videos about aliens. But my experience with YouTube tells me this absolutely could have happened. It's way more likely that YouTube did this than he got anally probed by an ET.
For sure.
No doubt about that. All right. So help us with our brand new YouTube channel at Deace Show on YouTube. And then you can help us on our podcast because if you like to listen to it, and I know a lot of you tuned in right now do, please hit subscribe or on iTunes follow, and that way every time we do a new episode, it shows up in your feed every time. And then also you can leave us a 5-star review and let everyone know how much you love the show if you do. And thanks to all of you that have done that. And thanks to our friends over at Patriot Mobile as well. Yes, we won the election. That's a good thing. Let's be happy. Let's be optimistic. But the fight is just now beginning, and now is the time to take the stand, and you can stand with Patriot Mobile, who has been on the avant-garde leading the charge of the parallel economy as America's only American mobile phone provider. Talked about Patriot Mobile on our show for years, and then I just didn't want to make the switch. I thought it'd be too much of a hassle, like I'm sure what at least some of you in our audience think right now. And then one day during COVID, T-Mobile sent out a mass message saying, hey, we're going to start censoring text for misinformation. And I'm like, that's it. I'm done. I don't care how big of a hassle it is. Not to mention we're all locked down, so I've got some free time. So we're making the switch right now. And it wasn't a hassle at all. Patriot Mobile made it happen ASAP. And they've been great to our family ever since. And so then you start wondering, well, is it just because I'm one of their endorsers? No. I mean, the amount of great stories from all of you that I've heard in our audience dealing with Patriot Mobile has been pretty overwhelming since we made that switch going on 5 years ago as well. Switching is easy. Keep your number. You can upgrade your phone, keep your phone, switch your number, whatever you want to do. They'll make it happen for you. They've got multiple networks within their main hub, so you can switch within those networks anytime you need to if there's a better signal coverage for you elsewhere. And they got a free month of service to get you started now when you go to patriotmobile.com/Steve. Get started with a free month of service now. patriotmobile.com/Steve. That's a free month of service to get you started at patriotmobile.com/Steve. Our first Theology Thursday of the year, and we are going to put a pause on our study of the book of Romans for just this week, and we'll pick it up again next week right where we left off there in Romans chapter 6, and we'll see. Do you guys think we're going to be able to finish this year?
No.
You don't?
No.
I think it's possible we might be able to finish it this year. I do. I think it's possible. We got through 5.5 chapters in 8 months last year. But it wasn't till about halfway through that we switched it to a full hour, right?
That's true. Right.
I think it might be possible that we will get to the end, or we'll get pretty close to the end by the end of this year.
I think we'll definitely get close.
Okay. The reason why I wanted to put a pin in it just for this week is because the topic of Islam and immigration and diversity and multiculturalism is dominating the news right now, between the grooming rape gangs coming from Pakistani Muslim immigrants into the UK to even here. We had an American who served his country with distinction in the military, and then after that service somehow got inculcated into Islamic radicalism and committed a heinous act of terrorism that killed at least 15 people on New Year's Day in New Orleans. So this has been in the news again. And a lot of the old conversations are happening all over again. A lot of the euphemisms and fallacies are being repeated. And I thought that we needed to take a time out before we get into the policy that we are debating here. And we need to understand the worldviews that are at stake. And we need to start with worldview. You need to start there. And then you frame your policies based off of worldview, both the worldview that you're trying to promote and the worldview that you're trying to diminish, because worldview is destiny. What you think about all day long and the way you think about it, you will become. Your faith is the foundation of your worldview. Every decision you make as a human being, provided you are of sound mind and body, every decision you make is a creedal statement, every single one. Starts with some form of faith. Faith in something. Every single moral decision you make starts with faith. That faith will then be the foundation of the beliefs that will then be what inspire your behaviors and responses and emotions, and your behaviors, responses, and emotions ultimately come full circle to testify to the rest of us. What is your faith? What is it you really believe or believe in? And if you want to be effective in a worldview fight, you have to understand three-dimensional thinking. The first dimension is to understand why you believe what you believe. And that is fundamental to how we do our show every single day. It's why we're going verse by verse to the book of Romans right now. Why do you believe what you believe? Why do I believe as an evangelical what I believe? Why does Aaron as an evangelical believe what he believes? Why does Todd as a Catholic believe what he believes? That's the first dimension. By the way, that's a biblical commandment. Peter writes, he commands that we are to have reasons for the hope that we have. And the Greek word there is apologia, where we get our term apologetics, which means like a ready defense. The second dimension, and it's these latter two dimensions that we're going to be focused on in this hour today. The second dimension is to understand, why do other people believe what they believe? What do other worldviews believe? Where are they coming from? Now, there is very little understanding within the Christian church today of why we believe what we believe. There have been polls in recent years from Pew showing a majority of Christians don't know what the Great Commission is. Barna has done surveys for going on 2 decades now, showing about 8 to 9% of Christians have a biblical worldview. And he's not describing some of the complicated subject matter we've gotten into with Romans. He's talking about, like, did Jesus rise from the dead? Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? Basic Sunday school stuff for previous generations. And then the third dimension, and this is now, so the first dimension is foundation. And what is it that I believe, and why do I believe that? What's my foundation? All right. The second dimension is discernment. Okay, then what do people who don't think what I think, belief systems that aren't the same as my own, where are they coming from? We're going to get into some of that here. And then once a foundation is established with your own worldview and you are able to discern other people's worldviews, this is now where we get to the third dimension, persuasion. Understanding why people believe what they believe about what you believe. Man, if we even just did the first dimension, this country would be so much better off. If we got to number 2, we'd make a lot different decisions in the macro political arena than we have, as you're going to find as we talk about Islam here in a moment. And then if we got to the third, well, that's how superpowers get built. But we don't do that stuff anymore. Now it's racist to get to the third dimension. To understand what other people believe about what you believe, and the full intent of all this is persuasion. I mean, if you don't want to persuade people to your worldview, might I suggest your worldview is one not worth having. You've chosen the wrong worldview if you don't want to persuade people to it. I'm reminded, we haven't talked about this, Todd, in many years, but I'm reminded about 20 years ago, the atheist thinker Christopher Hitchens did a series of debates with Doug Wilson from Moscow, Idaho. I can't remember if they were in print or in person or a little bit of both. Might have been a little bit of both. And a woman purporting to be a Christian, after observing or reading one of these debates, sent him a note and said, you know what, that Doug Wilson guy just is so narrow-minded, so close-minded, so bigoted. I'm a Christian too, I love Jesus too, but I kind of like your open-minded view on things like the virgin birth and original sin and the inerrancy of Scripture. Thank you for being a purveyor of tolerance and diversity. Christopher Hitchens' response to her is an all-time classic. An all-time classic. He wrote back to her, Madam, I appreciate the kind words, but might I presume that if you don't believe in the virgin birth, you don't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, and you don't believe that Jesus Christ physically rose from the dead, you may be a lot of things, and a lot of them may be laudable and noble of you. But one thing you are not is a Christian.
Amen.
And that's the truest thing Christopher Hitchens said in his entire life, probably, is that right there.
Why? And why is it that guy who has to tell her that? Why? This is my point. What I loved about that quote about Bonhoeffer. It's evil. We should be the first to say it, not the last.
For the same reason that in chapter 1 of the book we're studying in the Bible, Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel.
Right.
Because we get ashamed of it. So today, I want us to come away from this with a better understanding of an Islamic or Quranic worldview. It is vitally important to understand where Islam and the Quran are coming from, what it believes, what it claims, and then what it believes and claims about the biblical worldview that this country and Western civilization was founded upon. Vitally important to know this, because we're mingling these two cultures now at rates never done before. Since 9/11, this country has taken in over 2.5 million people from Islamist-dominated countries. They would equal the 37th most populous state, the 4th most populous city. What did Nigel Farage say this week? That there's just no way to win a national election in England moving forward if you offend 75% of Muslims. So we are mingling these two cultures at rates they've never been mingled before, and we are seeing the conflicts of these two cultures now. You are kufar, you are infidel, unbeliever. Your women and property are for Allah. I can use it for my own devices. That's what my religion teaches me, or variations of it do. And they are using the women accordingly of the country they've conquered. By the way, that's not just a thing in Islam. That's just human instinct. I mean, that's what conquerors do. One of the signs of being conquered is the men are emasculated. Are we emasculating our men in the West now?
Oh, look at a brisk pace.
Yes, indeed.
And enjoying it.
Indeed. The men are emasculated and your women are raped and trafficked. That happens to every civilization that gets conquered going back to the beginning of humankind. Is that happening in the West right now? Islam is many things. A dominionist conquering religion is one of them, fundamentally. So we need to understand then, what is this worldview that we have imported? Where do these instincts come from? Now, this is going to be a basic lesson. When this is done, go fact check this on your own. Go research this on your own. Dive deeper into these topics if you want. This is enough for you to understand enough to be dangerous, to understand enough to be asking the right questions, and to undo some of the things that you've been told that are not true, and to tell you some of the things you weren't told that are true. So let's start with point number 1. We're going to check ourselves. Have to check our own worldview here. Our own worldview says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Unless they don't agree with you, worship a different God, then you can do whatever you want to them and say whatever you want about them and blaspheme and smear them and treat them as non-essential humans. That's what Jesus said?
No.
No, that's not. The sentence just stops at love your neighbor as yourself. Aren't any qualifiers? Aren't any codicils? No? Okay. So we have to start with, let's start with us. The biblical worldview says, we're not going to abandon our own worldview in search of seeking out another. And our own worldview says judgment begins in the house of God first. Our own worldview says to be concerned about the beam in your own eye rather than the speck of dust in your brother's. All right. Our own worldview says it is worse to know God's word and not do it than to not know God's word and disobey it. Okay. I mean, on and on and on and on and on and on it goes. Accountability within a biblical worldview is an inside-out construct. Now, does that mean it never gets to the out? That's not what it means. But it starts inside out. It starts inside out. So we have to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. We cannot automatically assume everybody here that's immigrated to the country or was born here and believes in Islam. We cannot assume terrible things about people. You wouldn't want that done of you.
Judge not, lest ye be judged.
Correct.
For by the standard you judge
yes.
others, you also will be judged.
Correct. That's another quantification of what it means to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Correct. Jesus died for those that are within the enclave of Islam, everybody as much as he did for those of us that are called to salvation in Christ, for such as once, for some of us. So we cannot lose this. Now, I have a feeling that moving forward, when I get asked questions about this, the fact that I opened this entire discussion with that point will be completely edited out and forgotten. But again, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. We do not violate the God-given rights of people because they have different beliefs than ours. When people act on things and beliefs that God says are wrong or immoral, that's when their God-given rights get violated. You commit murder, you're not a free person anymore, right? You commit rape, you're not a free person anymore. You have committed things that the one true God of the universe says are wrong and immoral. Therefore, the wages of sin is death. You worked for sin, and death to your God-given rights you will receive. But we don't instantly profile people and cancel them unless they give us fruit on the tree and evidence worthy of such. So we have to start with ourselves. Make sure we got the right heart here, starting with me. Number 2, you need to understand the history of Islam. Islam has been a warrior religion from the very beginning. Muhammad spent his last 20 years of life in basically constant warfare. And we're dealing with third world, the most violent forms of warfare you could imagine. One of the most infamous battles Muhammad fought in is what was called the Battle of the Trench. And there was a Jewish tribe that had made an alliance with Muhammad during this battle, kind of a non-aggression pact. And they even helped him build the trenches he needed to win this battle. They would not fight with him because of all the negative things he was saying about Jews. Now, why do Muslims say this? I'm going to explain that to you as well. But they did aid him in his battle. But because they would not go so far as to kill for Muhammad, what Muhammad did is he went to every male member of this Jewish tribe that was pubescent age or older and had them all beheaded. After he died, Islam was a warrior religion. In the 1400 years since his death, Islam has been, 1300 years, has been a warrior religion. There has never been a time that Islam systemically was not at war with, and when I'm talking war, I'm not talking like Luther and Erasmus writing blogs, nasty blogs about each other on Gutenberg's printing press, guys. I'm talking swords to throats, soldiers on horses, conquering hordes, war. That's what I'm talking about, okay? I'm not talking about a trial at Wittenberg. I'm not minimizing those things. They're what gave us Western civilization, but that's not the kind of war I'm talking about, guys. Real stuff. Masses of people dying. There has never been a time Islam has either not been at war with Christendom or itself. In fact, this brings me to point number 3. Islam went to war against Christianity right away. Within mere years after Muhammad's death, Islam went to conquer Jerusalem and the Holy Land and take it away from the Christians. Right away. And there was no nation of Israel. Didn't exist. And it hadn't existed for 500 years, more than 500 years. Islam has been at perpetual warfare with Christianity for 1,300 years or itself. If you were to ask an Islamic scholar who is an honest person, why has there never been any kind of reformation in Islam any kind of like Vatican conclaves about the direction of the church within Islam. Why has there never been any like free society based on Islam? They'll tell you things like, well, because of colonization. And they're right about that. It is because of colonization. What they're going to lie to you about, though, is who did the colonizing. They're going to say, well, we're the colonizers, right? The white Western Christian devils. No, it was their own people colonized them. It's called the Ottoman Empire. It existed for almost a millennia. Before the Ottoman Empire, Islam was broken into a series of nation states, individual nation states, sheikhs, clerics, sultans. The Ottoman Empire went to war against all of them and conquered them. Now, many of the places, by the way, where these Islamic states existed, Egypt, Assyria or Iraq, Lebanon, Damascus, Syria, or Antioch, they weren't originally Muslim either. They were Christian. So first, the local Muslims took over this civilization from the Christians. And again, it was not by debate or referendum, by war. They slaughtered them. They drove them out. And then the Ottomans came off the top rope and said, hey, now we'll take over you. So yes, it's because of colonization. The Ottomans did the colonizing. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was broken up again into smaller nationalistic identity Islamic states. And for every Ataturk there was in Turkey, there were 10 other places within the Muslim world where they reverted back to exactly what they were beforehand. Because no one can rise above their own worldview. For a while, there were some states like Iran with the Shahs, where it looked like they would continue to adopt some form of Western practice. And then eventually, the Ayatollahs took them over too. There's no Pax Romana in Islam. It does not exist. No period like it. Because Islam, to point number 4, point number 4 here. Islam doesn't mean peace like what you've been told. That's not what the word means. It's not what it means. It means submission. That's what Islam means. Islam means submission. That brings me to point 5. Jihad does not mean holy war like you've been told. It doesn't mean that either. That's not true. Jihad actually means inner or my struggle. That's what it means. Inner struggle or my struggle. Inner or my struggle over what? The spreading of the dominion of Islam. Every Muslim is called to jihad. Every single one. The debate is over the method of jihad. But it is not an option for a Muslim to not seek to actively spread the dominion of Islam. Now, some of you are going to say, well, Christianity talks a lot about submission. The Bible does. You guys have a great commission. This will be a point I'll address more in full later, but you have to understand that the Quran, a Quranic worldview, is a pure bastardization of Judaism and Christianity. Just a pure bastardization of it. I'll go into more detail on this next segment. But for now, the submission in Islam is not the same as submission within Christianity. Submission within Christianity is a mutual exercise. It's not necessarily one of hierarchy or coercion or power. But submission, by the way, to give my power away. I give away, as a wife, the enmity that the curse says I had for my husband. I give that away and submit to him and respect him. As a husband, I give away the enmity I have for my wife and submit to God by loving her as Christ loved the church. Now, how did Christ love the church? He gave his own life for it, laid down his life for it, gave everything he had. That's what a man is called to do for his wife. It's not about coercion. It's not the same kind of submission at all. There is no precedent at all within Christianity for what Islam has historically done as a religion of conquest. There's no precedent for it. In fact, the Holy Roman Empire was formed in order to defeat Islamic conquest of the Christian West. So, just as we've seen in our parlance, words like tolerance and diversity go full Princess Bride, that doesn't mean what I think you think it means, right? The same goes between Islam when it comes to dominion and what it means when it comes to submission. Point number 6. The Quran, the word Quran means recite. That's what it means. The problem is Muhammad cannot read or write. He claims the angel Gabriel. I'm sure it's just a pure coincidence that Muhammad claimed one of the only three angels that is given a name in the Bible. Michael, Gabriel, Lucifer. Only three. I'm sure it's a pure coincidence that that's the angel that he claims spoke to him. There's a lot of these coincidences because it's a bastardization of Judaism and Christianity, which I'll talk more about here soon. But the reason why it's important you understand that Muhammad could not read or write is because we have no original writings of the Quran, like we do epistles, for example, in the New Testament. We don't. And in fact, there was great division within Islam right after he died. They broke into two camps. He didn't have a clear line of succession. So they broke into two camps. You know them today as Sunnis and Shias. And they went to war against one another about who was the true line of succession to Muhammad. Both sides have created multiple hadiths. I know after 9/11, you were taught there was hadith singular. There's multiple hadiths. Multiple. And for all the violence that is advocated within the Quran, it's in this hadith, and these hadiths are way more militant and violent than even the Quran is. Now, I've said this a few times already. The Quran is basically a bastardization of Christianity and Judaism. When we come back, I'm going to put some flesh on that for you, some meat on that bone, and quantify it for you next.
The Steve Deace Show.
All right, so let's recap our points here. Number one, when discerning opposing worldviews, we are still commanded to love our neighbors, we love ourselves. And Christ died on the cross for Muslims and Hindus every bit as much as he did for you and me. So we have to go into it with that premise. That doesn't mean don't be discerning. That doesn't mean we just accept everything as true. That's not true. But ultimately, the most important thing to God is people. He sent his son to die for people. Number two, the history of Islam and Muhammad shows perpetual warfare, including some of the most violent type. The early Islamic conquering hordes created their own curved sword that was one of the most vicious weapons human warfare had ever seen up until that point in history. So violence is endemic to Islam, not the exception. It's endemic, even against other Muslims. Number three, Islam went to war against Christianity right away, literally right away after Muhammad's death, and has perpetually been at war for Christianity for 1,300 years when not at war with itself. And there doesn't need to be a nation state called Israel for that to be true. In fact, from 110 AD to AD 1948, there was no nation called Israel on this earth. Islam existed all but 600 years of that period and went to war against Christianity the entire time. Next. The word Islam does not mean peace as you've been told. It means submission. But not submission the way the Bible teaches it. This is more subjugation. There's no love your neighbor as you love yourself in Islam. In fact, you are taught that you can basically do whatever you want to the kuffar, to the infidel, the unbeliever. Jihad does not mean holy war. That's the next point, as you've been told. Like it's an exception. Jihad is an expectation. It actually means inner or my struggle, or the inner struggle every Muslim has to spread the dominion of Allah. Now, just because everyone is called to jihad doesn't mean everyone believes in violence. The vast majority do not. But everyone who commits to Allah is committing to spread his dominion, to jihad. And their ultimate struggle as a Muslim is to do so. Next, the Quran means recite. Unfortunately, Muhammad could not read or write. He was illiterate. We don't have original writings. If you've ever read the Quran, I have. It's very random. It's very stream of conscious. It's not really even put into a particular order. And just like with the Bible, if you want to pick and choose things, you can. But then you have to see the context of what the actual founder taught. You have to look at the behavior of their first followers and how the first and earliest Christians behaved in the immediacy of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ compared to how the first and immediate followers of Muhammad behaved are diametrically different. You know a tree by its fruit. Now, the Quran is a bastardization of Christianity and Judaism. For example, all the same patriarchs you'll find in the Bible, Abraham, Moses, they're all there. It's just twisted. Instead of Abraham's covenant going through Isaac, it goes through his other son, Ishmael. But other than that, same story. There's a flood, everything. It's all there. And they view the Jews as having robbed them of their birthright and lying that Allah's covenant went through Isaac instead of Ishmael, that they are the true people of the promise and not the Jews, and that's the origin of the hatred. There's no reconciling that, frankly. One side will have to give up some of what it believes to make that happen. This is why it's been historically so difficult to get peace in this region and peace between Jews and Muslims. Jesus is in the Quran. Mary is in the Quran, in fact. But Jesus is in the Quran. The Quran teaches that Jesus was arrested by the Jews. And they tried to crucify him, but then Allah spared him of crucifixion. I think it's Judas Iscariot. Maybe he put up on the cross instead. Somebody substituted for him. I can't remember the name. I think it's Judas. And then some traditions within Islam, they have eschatological end times theology differences, just like Christianity does. And some of those traditions, because Jesus kind of disappears in the Quran after this, some of those traditions, their eschatological traditions are that Jesus comes back to slay all the Christians, all the polytheists who taught that God had a son. When the Muslims took over the Dome of the Rock where the Temple Mount was in Judaism, when they took that over and erected the Dome of the Rock over the Temple Mount, they carved into the ceiling the words in Arabic, God has no son. So a lot of this is the exact same narrative that comes from the law and the prophets and the New Testament, just twisted, bastardized to fit a different narrative. That's what I mean by a bastardization of Christianity and Judaism. That's essentially what Islam is. Other than the advocacy of violence, there's really no other original thought in Islam. Everything else is just stuff that already existed within Judaism and Christianity in the 7th century that was just twisted to fit a different narrative. That's a fact. Now, we could disagree whether it was twisted, but you can't disagree whether it was twisted. You can argue with whether or not the twisting was justified. But to do that, you would then have to come to the conclusion the Bible was wrong. You cannot have both the Quran and the Bible. They have completely different narratives while asserting many of the same facts. So one has to be wrong and the other has to be right. They could both be wrong, but they can't both be right. And this is why Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God, and neither do Muslims and Jews. The nuances you have come to expect from Christianity, like love your neighbor as you love yourself, do not exist within Islam. And this explains why a Muslim is safer and more prosperous living here in the country they call the Great Satan than they would be anywhere in the Muslim world. Anywhere. Literally anywhere. Unless they were a member of a royal family, they would be safer and more prosperous living here in the United States than they would be in any country that's actually dominated by their stated worldview. You ever notice that you'll never see people like digging the Quran, archaeologically digging the Quran to prove it one way or the other, like you've seen with the Bible since the early 20th century? You know why? To question the Quran is death. Ask a Muslim, why is the Quran true? Because it said so. Well, why does it say so? Because it's true. Just circular logic. All this is true. It's all true. Therefore, when we get to the actual policy now, because of all the things I just stated, I mean, consider that Islam provides no eternal assurance for the believer. None. None. You could perform all 5 pillars of Islam and you are still not guaranteed to be in a state of grace with Allah. This is one of the reasons why they've been attracted to violence throughout the ages. Ensuing hadiths taught that there was one way to gain eternal salvation from Allah, and that was to die in the cause of jihad. Now, you gave your life as a martyr's death. And so this is why they've never had a hard time throughout the history of Islam recruiting these kinds of sects or individuals. Allah is not a personal God. He doesn't offer nuance. And he doesn't offer any form of a guaranteed salvation. Nothing. Nothing. Now, within Christianity, we have sects. Catholics do. We have several Protestant sects that believe you can lose your salvation. But that's not the same as believing there's no guarantee of salvation. It's not the same thing. Believing that you can violate your covenant with Christ, that you would lose your salvation, is not the same as believing that you can't have a covenant with God to begin with. That's what Islam teaches. There's no covenant to be had. There's only 2 reasons a Muslim wants to move to a Western country. Only 2. To get away from Islam or to impose it. Those are the only 2 reasons. Because otherwise, as I just laid out for you, just a very cursory analysis, there's very little in common between these 2 belief systems of the Islamic world and the Western world. Very little in common. Very little. And that's why the daily lives lived in the Western world and the Muslim world are dramatically different by and large. Because the beliefs are dramatically different and the values are. And the assertions and the narrative is. So there's only 2 reasons then. I mean, think about it. Just turn it the other way, right? We'll tell you on this show, there's a law of philosophy. If the inverse of a statement is not also true, then it's what's called a fallacy, right? So then let's turn it around, Todd. What would be the reasons a Christian would want to go live in a predominantly Muslim country? there would only really be one. You want to take Christianity there. That's why. Like, we rail against California, Oregon, and Washington State. Jordan, Dubai, considered the two most modern Muslim nations on earth. Jordan and Dubai versus Oregon and California. Where you want to live, guys? And how would literally every non-Muslim human being on planet Earth answer that question, do you think?
Oregon and California.
Oregon and California. Yeah. See my point? So the inverse is also true. You don't only want to move in these places because you want to take your belief system there. So there's only two reasons that a Muslim comes to the West: to escape Islam or to spread it. And that's where the vetting process comes in. If you want to escape it and immerse into our culture, then you can be an immigrant. But the minute you act out to show otherwise, you're gone. That's why I said last week, all those people that went into Manhattan and protested for the glorious Intifada, they've outed themselves now. Now we're not judging people. You've told us who you are, correct? Round them all up and put them on a raft in open sea and let the glorious Intifada come and get them. You're not, you've self-deported, you're out. I'll stop here. Questions, comments, or insults?
Jimmy Carter, his funeral today. The early part of our adult life, Steve, up until 9/11, a constant presidential obsession, Republican or Democrat, with Middle East peace deals. Jimmy Carter fervently believed bringing that as a Christian of some strain. Now, whatever his version of Christianity was in 1980 versus the gay marriage is cool, Jimmy Carter, when he was in his 70s and 80s, I don't exactly know.
And God's pro-abortion, he believed that too. Yeah.
But this has been going on for a very long time, and because we are like we are with COVID, and what we said earlier in the show is about what Steve said at the top of the show. You know, if you can't get morality right unless you get God right, and because we don't get God right in the West, we're going to get every application of morality wrong, including as it applies to Islam, and that's what Steve is laying out for you right now. So much so that in Great Britain, when in the face of Islamic rape gangs, they just voted yesterday in Parliament, and I believe the vote was something like 360-ish to 111 in favor of not looking into the rape gangs. Mm-hmm. This is, you laid out what people don't want to know, but quite frankly, Steve, it's not a big secret that you just unlocked. For how many decades now? We like our lies too much, Steve, to look in the face what you just said. Because if we look it in the face, the answers really aren't that complicated of how the West must proceed. But we're nodding yes to Muslim rape gangs instead.
I remember growing up listening to the show on WHO radio in Des Moines, and on a number of occasions, you would make a comment when talking about some of these issues or similar issues. Not all cultures are created equal. And at that time, this was, 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. At that time, it's like, whoa, you're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to say that, especially in polite company. Well, this is an obvious outcrop of that obvious truth. Do you think anywhere in the decision makers, like the actual decision makers, look anywhere across the West right now, that we are even approaching, again, amongst the decision makers, amongst the elite, the power brokers, do you think we're at the point where we're ready to admit that? No. I think we're closer than we were.
Closer, but
I think we're closer, but we're still, the answer is no. If you forget what Steve just laid out about Islam, you will lose everything. Everything. One of the greatest teachers is history itself. Probably the greatest teacher other than Jesus Christ. And history has shown us that Islam will not stop because it won't stop. It's not just a bastardization, although it is. It's not just a cheap knockoff, though it is. It's not just an adulteration, though it is, of our faith. It's the faith of the enemy. Going back to, I spoke to an angel. He was Gabriel. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Muhammad spoke to an angel. I'm pretty sure it wasn't Gabriel.
You've been given the information. Fact check it. Do research it for yourself. Do with it what you will. But now no one with the sound of my voice cannot say they were not warned. Romans 8:28.